Hey there, welcome back to part 2 of our tech talk about K9s here in the Stackable channel. Today we'll take a look at some of the more involved actions that you can use K9s for. We'll operate on objects, we'll change objects, we'll delete objects, we'll restart stuff. So basically anything that we can do to change stuff in Kubernetes with K9s we'll take a look at today. So let's get started. Now let's move on to the actions that we can take upon these objects. As usual, most of them have been listed up top here, but you can also hit question mark and that'll give you some more that haven't been printed up there. Some of these actions will work for all objects in here. So basically if I hit D, this is for describe, and that'll give me an abbreviated or distilled version of the YAML object that's been applied to the cluster. So right here you can see this describes a pod with a couple of things. And down here, which is quite interesting, K9s also lists all the events that have happened in Kubernetes for this pod. So if something goes wrong in your cluster, this is usually the first place to check. Sometimes though, you don't need the abbreviated version, but the full version. If I hit, you simply hit Y, and this gives you the full YAML version of the object that's stored in Kubernetes. And by hitting F, you can get that as a full screen as well, which is quite nice if you need to select some things from it to work with in an external editor, for example. You don't have to do that though. You can simply hit C as well. And then down here you can see content copied to clipboard. So now this entire object has been copied to my clipboard and I can simply paste it into my external editor to do with it what I need to do with it. What I don't need to do with it is edit and reapply it, because by hitting E, K9s actually opens up the default editor on my system. And now I could, for example, I don't know, maybe let's add a new test label here, test. We're now simply saving this file and now hitting D again. You can see down here, K9s has edited this object in Kubernetes on the fly, applied my changes, and I can now read them back by describing this object. And all these functions work across all objects. So if I now went to look at deployments, for example, even here I could do YAML, I could do edit and edit it. So basically, these are the generic functions that you can use for all objects in K9s. On top of these generic functions, there are also specific functions that only work with a specific type of object. So let's get back to the pods, for example. For pods, there's some quite nice functionality in here. So if I hit Control F, for example, this allows me to forward a pod to my local host. So if you've ever done this with kubectl, you need to remember or know the port that is exposed. Whereas K9s actually has the nice functionality of showing the ports that are exposed here. So if I'm now interested in port 9092, you can see down there port forward activated. So now that port will be available on my local machine to connect to this port directly. You can also, if you are interested in looking at what's happening in the pod, by hitting S and then selecting which container you want, you can get a shell inside of this pod. So now we can cd/stackable, and you see in here there's the Kafka binaries. So basically I'm now inside of the pod and can debug or work with whatever's in here, which is quite useful at times. Talking about debugging, sometimes you're also interested in looking at the logs. So I simply hit L, not much here because they age out fairly quickly. But they are stored in Kubernetes, and you can see up top here, I can influence the time frame that I'm looking at. So by hitting 0, I'm looking at the tail of the log. By hitting 1, I'm looking at the head of the log. And I can also say I'd like to see the past 15 minutes, for example, by hitting 4. And that is quite nice as well. As with the YAML functionality, we can watch this in full screen. And you can see we can turn auto scroll on and off. So basically, same thing as tail minus F. We can look at logs continuously here. And one final thing that I quite like for pods is by hitting T, you get copy files into and out of the pod. By toggling this X up here, you can switch between download and upload, and then simply type your local path, like temp log.log, and we want that in /temp on the pod. And by now hitting OK, K9s would upload the file from my local machine to the pod, where I can then work with it from a shell. Moving on from pods though, we can maybe look at stateful sets, for example. Those have some quite nice functionality as well. You can see here, this stateful set, for example, has 3 out of 3 nodes ready. And if I hit R on this, I can restart this stateful set. So by just typing OK here. And now let's go back to the pods. Now down here you can see one of our Kafka brokers has been restarted. And once this is done, yeah, there you can see the first broker became ready again, and then the rolling restart, it'll now work its way all through the stateful set, which is quite a nice thing to do. Or what we can also do is we can scale a stateful set. So by typing S, you can see currently this has 1 replica. I can now type 3, and then the stateful set would be scaled to 3 replicas dynamically. And that's all we have for today. But we only just scratched the surface of what you can do with K9s. So do feel free to dig in, go download it. We'll put a link in the description below and play around with it. It can make your life so much better when you work with Kubernetes on a day-to-day basis. See you next time.